There is terrain on Earth where no helicopter can reliably operate because the weather is too severe, where no wheeled vehicle can move because the ground pressure would sink it, where no conventional tracked vehicle can advance because the gradient and the snow depth combine to create conditions beyond their engineering limits. The Scandinavian Arctic in winter, the Scottish Highlands in blizzard, the Hindu Kush in spring thaw, the Falkland Islands peat bogs, Afghanistan's high-altitude passes, northern Canada in January. In every one of these environments, military forces have needed to move people and equipment and supplies across terrain that their standard vehicles could not cross. And in every one of these environments, over more than 40 years of operations across 20 nations, the answer has been the same vehicle, the BV-206. Not a tank, not a helicopter, not a wheeled armored carrier. A two-part articulated tracked vehicle connected by a central steering joint, so low to the ground that it floats on snow rather than sinking into it, so flexible in its articulation that it can climb gradients that stop conventional tracked vehicles, so amphibious that it crosses rivers and lakes without preparation. It looks wrong. It looks like two boxes connected by a hinge. It looks like something designed by an engineer who had never seen a real military vehicle. It has been operated by 20 nations for more than 40 years. No nation that has fielded it has found anything that replaces it for the terrain where it operates. The BV-206 began as a Swedish civilian design. Hägglunds, the same company that would later produce the CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle, developed the articulated tracked carrier concept in the 1960s for forestry and utility operations in Swedish terrain. The Swedish military observed what the vehicle could do in Swedish Arctic conditions and recognized that it solved a problem they had been unable to solve with any conventional vehicle. The problem was Lapland, the northernmost province of Sweden, above the Arctic Circle, covered in birch scrub and pine forest, crossed by rivers and lakes that froze in winter and thawed into swamp in spring, with snowfall depths that regularly exceeded 2 meters. Swedish military doctrine required the ability to move troops and supplies through Lapland in all seasons. No vehicle in Swedish inventory could do it reliably. The BV-206 could. The engineering principle was deceptively simple. Two tracked units, front and rear, connected by a joint that allowed articulation in both the horizontal and vertical planes. The front unit carried the engine and driver. The rear unit carried cargo or passengers. The connection between them was not rigid. The two units could pivot relative to each other, allowing the vehicle to conform to terrain features that would stop a rigid-framed vehicle. When the front unit climbed a slope, the rear unit could remain at a different angle. When the front unit crossed a ditch, the rear unit maintained traction on flat ground, while the front unit negotiated the obstacle. The tracks were wide and long, distributing the vehicle's weight across a large surface area. The ground pressure of the BV-206 was approximately 0.17 kilograms per square centimeter, lower than a human footstep. A person walking through 2 meters of Arctic snow would sink. The BV-206 floated across the surface. That ground pressure figure was the key to everything. It allowed the BV-206 to cross terrain that no other vehicle approached: deep powder snow, peat bog, tundra permafrost, frozen lake ice too thin for any other tracked vehicle. The vehicle was amphibious without preparation. It entered water and swam, the tracks providing propulsion. River crossings that would stop a tank column were crossed by the BV-206 in minutes. The Norwegian Army evaluated the BV-206 in the early 1970s and recognized immediately that it solved their Arctic mobility problem completely. Norway operates above the Arctic Circle. Norwegian military doctrine required the ability to reinforce positions in Finnmark, Norway's northernmost county, in winter conditions that regularly made roads impassable. The BV-206 could do what no other vehicle could. Norway ordered it in large numbers. The British Army followed. Operations in Norway under NATO's Allied Command Europe required British forces to move through exactly the terrain where the BV-206 excelled. British Royal Marines deployed to Norway annually for Arctic training brought BV-206s. When the Falklands War began in April 1982, British forces deploying to the South Atlantic faced terrain they had not anticipated. The Falkland Islands are covered in peat bog and tussock grass. Wheeled vehicles sank. Conventional tracked vehicles struggled with the soft waterlogged ground. The BV-206s that the British had in inventory for Arctic operations were loaded onto ships and sent south. They were the only vehicles that could move cross-country across Falklands terrain. British forces advancing on Stanley used BV-206s to move equipment across ground that stopped everything else. The vehicle designed for Norwegian Arctic operations proved equally capable in South Atlantic peat bog because the ground pressure principle that made it work in snow made it work in soft ground of any kind. The operational lesson was definitive. The BV-206 was not an Arctic vehicle. It was a low ground pressure vehicle. Anywhere the ground was soft, deep, waterlogged, or snow-covered, the BV-206 could operate where nothing else could. That capability was not terrain-specific. It was physics. Afghanistan demonstrated this again. When coalition forces began operating in Afghanistan after 2001, they encountered terrain in the high mountain valleys and passes that conventional vehicles could not negotiate, not because of mines or enemy action, because the gradients and the soft, high-altitude soil combined to stop even tracked vehicles. Canadian, British, and Norwegian forces operating BV-206s in Afghanistan found that the vehicle's articulated design allowed it to climb gradients that tracked vehicles with rigid frames could not. The articulation meant the vehicle could flex its body to conform to the terrain, maintaining track contact on both units simultaneously. A rigid tracked vehicle, losing contact between its hull and the ground, loses traction. The BV-206 maintained contact because its two units could orient themselves independently. Marine operations proved another capability. When forces needed to cross rivers in Afghanistan without bridge support, the BV-206 entered the water and swam across. In conditions where the current was too strong for infantry to ford and no bridge was available, the BV-206 solved the problem. The German Bundeswehr operated BV-206s in Afghanistan. The Finnish Defense Forces used them. The Spanish Army, the Italian Army, the French Foreign Legion, the Dutch Marines. In total, more than 20 nations have operated the BV-206. Each of them purchased it because it could do something their other vehicles could not. And each of them discovered that the range of terrain where that capability applied was broader than they had expected when they bought it. Production of the BV-206 ran from 1981 to 1996. Hägglunds built approximately 11,000 vehicles. That production number made the BV-206 one of the most produced military vehicles of the Cold War era. More BV-206s were built than many famous tank designs. After production ended, the vehicles remained in service because nothing replaced them. Hägglunds developed the BVS-10, a larger and more protected successor, but the BV-206 remained in service alongside it because the BVS-10's greater weight increased its ground pressure and reduced its ability to float across the softest terrain. The original BV-206, with its extraordinary low ground pressure, could not be replicated in a heavier vehicle without abandoning the principle that made it work. Britain operates the BVS-10 for protected mobility in Arctic conditions and retains BV-206s for logistics and medical evacuation in soft terrain environments. Norway operates both. Finland operates BV-206s for logistics in terrain where the CV-90 cannot go. The two Swedish vehicles complement each other. The CV-90 fights on terrain where fighting vehicles can operate. The BV-206 supplies and supports in terrain where no fighting vehicle can follow. Together, they represent a complete Arctic military capability that no other nation has assembled from a single design tradition. The BV-206's influence on military vehicle thinking was significant and underappreciated. Before the BV-206, the military consensus was that tracked vehicles needed rigid frames for structural strength, and that articulation was a civilian engineering approach unsuitable for military use. The BV-206 demonstrated that articulation was not a compromise. In the specific conditions where ground pressure and terrain conformity determined whether a vehicle moved or stopped, articulation was superior to any rigid frame alternative. The vehicle that looked like two boxes connected by a hinge turned out to be the solution to a problem that 30 years of conventional military engineering had failed to solve. 20 nations bought it. 11,000 were built. It fought in the Falklands, operated in Afghanistan, supplied Norwegian Arctic positions, moved through Falklands peat and Swedish Lapland, and Canadian tundra and Scottish highland and alpine meadow. It crossed terrain where tanks could not follow and reached positions where helicopters could not land. It looked wrong. It was right.